we'd really like to thank all of you for attending our NGO team's second webinar titled The Future of Climate Refugees. So this webinar will address the issues of climate refugees and climate migration, and we will discuss the future challenges, but hopefully as well as opportunities for NGOs, for government, as well as us as individuals in providing support to those who are most vulnerable. So you will have an opportunity to hear from two renowned guest speakers and also Helder, Angela Eifert of Alight and Gail Woon of EARTHCARE, followed by a Q&A. So please be ready to type in your questions for either speaker. And again, many thanks for joining us for this really critical discussion. And I will pass it over to you, Joyce.
Thank you so much. So first, as Angela is not here yet, so we will start with Helder Perez. He is from the Bay Islands Foundation based in Honduras, and he's going to talk about climate migration. So Helder.
Hello, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Even though this topic isn't as pleasant, right? Honduras is a small country in Central America, surrounded by both the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. In the Atlantic Ocean, we have some islands. We call them the Bay Islands, and hence the name of my foundation. And also, the Atlantic Ocean is home to many indigenous groups, such as the Miskito peoples who live in La Mosquitia, which is the northernmost, easternmost region of our country. The Miskito peoples have lived in this area for thousands of years. They coexisted with nature by hunting and fishing, taking only what they need from it. And it is because of them that La Mosquitia today, 2023, holds the largest rainforest outside the Amazon on this hemisphere. And despite them being the stewards and guardians of this region, La Mosquitia has been pounded by the impacts of climate change. So here you have a region that is suffering from the impacts of a problem that they did not cause, and there's very little response that they've been having at the moment, right? The impacts of climate change in La Mosquitia is mostly related to sea level rise. This is a land that is flat, for most of it flat. And because of this, we have now salt water intrusion in the coastline. With the people are finding salt water in their wells. People are no longer being able to plant their crops. They plant cassava, yuca, we call it yuca in Spanish, cassava, beans. And whenever there's a hurricane, the surges from storms come even further inland, forcing the Miskito peoples to migrate inland or now to go somewhere else. Because of this, many peoples in La Mosquitia have lost their homes, their entire villages who have disappeared because of this, because of the rise in sea levels, and the associated risks like health risks and other social risks. So now we have people who have been displaced from their homes and are migrating to other countries, namely the United States and Spain. This is not, problems like this are not just particular to the Miskito. We have other indigenous groups like the Pech, who have suffered similar fates. The Garifuna, which is an Afro-American, what do you call it? Origins, yeah. And they too have lost their homes to the rise in sea levels. They too have lost their crops, and they too are migrating from Honduras to the United States and Spain, and now the UK even. So it's a problem that is pounding the peoples who are least responsible from this problem, and they have been offered no help from the government and the international assistance as well. So this is pretty much what we're dealing with right now.
Thank you so much, Helder. Really important information, and just wanted to thank you so much for providing that context, because I know it doesn't matter where we are in the world, we're going to have this challenge with climate migration. So it's nice to understand the perspective from Honduras and especially with the indigenous communities, because I know that with our next webinar, we will be discussing that topic also. So thank you so very, very much for that. And as we continue on with this, we would love for everybody to just feel free to go ahead and start jotting down some questions, even in chat. And Anji, if you would like to, oh no, you've got some pictures. Great, go ahead.
I just wanted to share this picture with you. This is this picture was taken in the Cojunta Lagoon in this region that I spoke before. It's called La Mosquitia, in the easternmost part of the country of Honduras. This is a remote place. There are no hotels in sight. There are no factories. There are no marinas. This is an indigenous land, right? And what we're seeing here is a lone palm tree sitting in the lagoon. This palm tree was not born in the middle of the lagoon. Where this palm tree was, palm tree grew on land, but because of the rise in sea levels, it is now surrounded by water. And this is the fate that many of our villages and our coastlines are suffering right now. We're not looking at a projection to what sea level rise will happen in 100 years. This picture was actually taken in 2014. So sea level rise, once again, is here. It is affecting indigenous communities, and it is not something that will occur in the distant future. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so very, very much. Really important information. And Anji, would you like to do the introductions for Gail?
Yes, of course. Thank you again, Helder, for sharing the ongoing struggles of communities, especially indigenous community, who are subjected to climate displacement. And I would like to introduce our first NGO speaker today, which is Gail Woon from EARTHCARE. Gail?
Greetings, everyone. On August 28, 2019, I was contacted by Jasper Ward, a reporter from the Nassau Guardian, asking me how the people of Grand Bahama were preparing for the arrival of Hurricane Dorian. In this slide, you see the grocery store lines which stretched from one end of the store to the other. I gave her a long interview and sent some background on my previous hurricane storm surge experience from Hurricanes Floyd, Francis, and Jean, all three of which made me and my family homeless, or the sanitized term is displaced. I also did an interview for Channel 212, our news. So that night, I was a part of a segment on approaching climate change Hurricane Dorian. I spoke about my post-traumatic stress disorder from previous hurricane experiences. My family and I prepared as best as we could for the storm. I was experiencing PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as I always do now when hurricanes are approaching our island. I was crying and having high anxiety. This was worse than other times, however, since I was carefully following the forecasts, the expected wind speeds, and the unprecedented height of the storm surge. I was certain that our island would experience catastrophic flooding on an order that we had never seen before. You see, I had recently completed a fellowship with Cornell University on climate change. Of 600 applicants, only 35 were chosen, and I was the only Bahamian fellow. We had concentrated on how to convince the general public of the urgency of the need for drawing down climate change. I have known about climate change since the 70s when we covered it in my oceanography classes. My first ever radio interview on ZNS Radio News was about global warming, as it was then called. Fast forward to September 1st, 2019, the forecast day of the arrival of climate-changed Hurricane Dorian to Grand Bahama Island. I was called at 8:30 a.m. by ZNS News, our national broadcasting station, to do a segment about storm surge for use in their live radio television coverage of the hurricane. The news crew picked me up and took me to Williamstown Beach, where we filmed a segment to air in the afternoon several times. I spoke about the king tides, which are higher than normal tides, and that since the storm was forecast to be with us at least 24 hours, that we would experience the storm surge of 15 to 25 feet high, together with the king tides, at least twice during the 24-hour period. I urged residents to evacuate themselves and their families as far from the coastlines as possible. 2 weeks after the storm, I was very upset when realizing all of the lives lost and wishing I had been more forceful in my warnings. Then months later, I was told by a friend that she saw my segment on storm surge and king tides and had moved her mother and herself to higher, safe ground, and thanked me profusely for saving their lives. I was very relieved to hear that. At 11 a.m. on Sunday, my daughter and I were dropped to the hurricane shelter. My significant other elected to stay with the house and take care of our pets and the house if any leaks were to occur. Our Bahamas Defense Force officer, Davis, assured him that he was doing the right thing to leave us in his care. We settled in, had a hot meal provided by the social services shelter manager. Jasper Ward called me on behalf of the Washington Post and the Nassau Guardian, and we agreed that she could call me early Monday morning at 6:30 a.m. for her 8 a.m. deadline. We spoke early that morning in time for her deadline. People came in gradually. By mid-afternoon, we had 20 of the maximum of 40 the shelter was to hold. A family came in on Sunday evening as the winds got higher and the rain started. It was close to dusk. The father started opening the windows as he thought it was stuffy. 10 minutes later, a quarter of the roof fell in on top of his family. Quickly, we were all evacuated downstairs. While we waited, I received another call from Jasper Ward, and I was able to tell her about our shelter losing the roof. I was fairly agitated because the roof had just fallen in on our shelter. I spoke with her, but was fairly brief because the water had begun streaming in above us from the compromised roof. She told me that she would call me later. All in all, I gave 3 reports to the Washington Post at various points during the storm. What I did not realize at the time was that each time she called me, she submitted a story that was published in the Washington Post, quoting me. I got to read them months later. Our Defense Force officer got permission to move us into the church itself after our shelter roof had caved in. The winds were getting stronger and stronger, and the rains increased. This slide shows you the view through a window, and the brown thing on top of the car was our roof from our first shelter. Through the night, more families and persons came in as we learned that subdivisions that had never flooded before were flooding, and quickly. At the same time, we learned that several shelters were being evacuated because they were either flooding or had lost their roofs. We were getting people from other shelters, including the special needs shelter, which had to be evacuated early while the hospital was flooding, and the people running for their lives from their flooded houses. By Monday morning, at the height of the storm, we had 300 evacuees in the one room. During this time, We did not know that people were being trapped in their roofs and evacuating as much as possible during the flooding of 70% of the island of Grand Bahama. This slide shows you a satellite view of climate change Hurricane Dorian over our island. The thin green line shows the edges of our island. The light blue is the 25-foot high storm surge. The few dark spots are the parts of the island that escaped the flooding by storm surge. Meanwhile, our Bahamas Defense Force Angel had been starting and running the generator periodically so that we could charge our phones. And he also had a portable Wi-Fi station so that we were almost never out of contact with the outside world. I had my college friends sending me videos of the Florida weather radar so that I knew the storm had effectively stopped on top of us and the long hours were going to be hell on earth. Also, throughout the ordeal, I was in contact with my Cornell University climate change fellows through our WhatsApp group, and they were praying for us from all over the world. One of my daughter's alumni from her high school came in with his family. They escaped as their house flooded with at least 3 feet of saltwater storm surge. I asked which area he was in. He replied, Hudson Estates. I said, oh no, that is close to our house. I quickly messaged and told my significant other that the flood was headed to our house. 20 minutes later, he messaged back that the flooding was there and he had to evacuate, had to run for his life. Our neighbors called to him, and at first the water was ankle deep. By the time he opened the door, a matter of minutes, to let our animals have run of the house and lock the bottom lock of the door, the water had risen to his thighs. They made a run for it over 2 blocks to the car that was waiting outside of the floodwaters. The shelter nearby had not opened, so thankfully he was able to make it to our shelter. At about this time, 6 p.m. on Monday, our Wi-Fi connections began to fail. My aunt in Maryland was messaging me on Facebook, asking me to provide rescue numbers for my uncle and aunt who were trapped in the roof of their house over the Casuarina Bridge in the deadly storm surge. I could see her messages, but when I tried to answer, my messages were failing. I was only able to communicate to her that our shelter had lost the roof and that I was not in a position to help. On Monday evening, our officer announced that during the night, the doors would be locked. By this time, I was truly terrified for our animals and for our safety in the church. We thought it prudent to try to get as high in the room as possible in the event the floodwaters came into the sanctuary. I had visions of being drowned in a locked room. We moved to the highest part of the church. As we got comfortable, our Defense Force officer must have gotten word from his command about other shelters flooding, and he ordered that only children and the elderly could be up in the high area of the church. Thus, we relocated back to the lower part of the church. Through that hellish night of 165-mile-per-hour winds and pelting rain, I kept feeling the carpet to see if the water was coming in. Not much sleep was had by anyone. The storm was over us for a grueling 40 hours. Our Defense Force officer asked everyone in the church if anyone had corned beef or tuna or grits, as we had to feed the children and the elderly. You see, our food supply and cleaning supplies had been in the large kitchen on the 2nd floor where the roof had failed. I had tried to help the shelter manager and went to get the bleach for the bathrooms, which were getting rather nasty since the water had been turned off for the duration of the storm. When I went to step in upstairs to try to get our supplies, I was pulled back by the Defense Force officer because the floor was now falling in due to the rains. They managed to feed everyone with a tiny pot of corned beef and a tiny pot of tuna and a large pot of grits. Gradually, we could feel the wind slowing in speed very, very slowly. By late Tuesday, people were trying to make their way to see how their houses had fared. When we were picked up by our friend, we found that our house was flooded and the cars as well. Thankfully, our pets were alive, although a bit scared. All in all, we were grateful to be alive and happy to be home, even if it was waterlogged. Later, we would learn that many souls were missing and had not survived this climate-changed Hurricane Dorian. To this day, we do not have an accurate count of the people lost. A whole settlement in Abaco was washed away. It housed undocumented persons, so no one really knows how many people were there. But there were no survivors from that area. The following day, I went to NEMA, the National Emergency Management Agency, to check in and saw our lovely Bahamas Defense Force officer, Davis. I ran up and gave him hugs and kisses and thanked him profusely for keeping us safe. The aftermath is another story. Here you can see an Army helicopter from the US that came to airlift a pregnant woman after the storm because our hospital was effectively destroyed. This chopper landed in the field 500 yards from my house. After the storm, it felt like we were in a war zone. There was a lot of air traffic from countries bringing much needed supplies to the survivors. I am still living the aftermath. I still cry, not because of an impending storm. No, this time I cry for my brethren who did not survive this horrific climate-changed Hurricane Dorian. For many months, over a year, we had to get potable water from stations like this. Our freshwater lens underground was contaminated with saltwater intrusion from the saltwater storm surge that was over the island for so long. Almost 4 years later, the water coming out of our taps is still not potable, with total dissolved solids higher than acceptable limits. Here, 2 of our EARTHCARE eco kids and their mom brought us a donation of food from their church after the storm. One thing the storm did was bring our community together in so many ways. We must adapt, be resilient, and draw down this climate crisis. Learn all that you can and do all that you can to teach your fellow men, women, and children that our actions contribute to the problem. Try hard to convince government and company leaders that they have an incredibly important responsibility to listen to the youth like Greta Thunberg, the Swedish teenager who is raising global awareness of the risks posed by global warming and climate change, and withholding politicians to account for their lack of action on the climate crisis. Bahamas, we are living and dying proof of the climate crisis. After the storm subsided, we found out that an Equinor oil facility on the island had a catastrophic failure of their tanks. Equinor officials admitted that this was the worst oil spill in the company's history, and they have facilities all over the world. Almost 4 years later, the oil still has not been cleaned up properly. Equinor should not be allowed to leave our country without cleaning this up properly. The climate emergency needs large corporations like Equinor, Shell, and Exxon to figure out a new model, work with NGOs, establish research centers, working on adaptation, resiliency, food security, and marine protected areas. Countries and large corporations could restore areas that have been degraded already and become the model for eco-educational tourism, working with all communities, restoring marine protected areas and coral reefs and not destroying them. The world is watching. The polluting countries and corporations can be part of this solution. And I sincerely hope that they can become a source for for drawing down the climate crisis instead of contributing to it. Bahamas after Dorian, we have seen that we are living and dying proof of the climate emergency. Together, let's all make the changes we need to in order to survive for the generations to come. Adapt, be resilient, and draw down climate change now. We have no time left for business as usual. If you love your children, your grandchildren, you must act. You must do all that you can to convince the people around you to do what is necessary to draw down climate change. Look at how the earth healed itself when we were all in lockdown for the beginning of the COVID pandemic in 2020. Skies cleared, pollution dissipated, animals came out of hiding. The earth instinctively knows what to do to heal itself, but it cannot heal it as long as we keep pumping fossil fuel emissions and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Don't do it for yourself. Do it for the future inhabitants of our earth. There is no time to waste. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Gail, for telling your story. Your resilience is really very inspiring, and we hope we can all learn from you. Before we move on to our next speaker, I just wanted to remind everyone to hold your questions until after Angela's final presentation, and we will open up the floor later for a Q&A. You are also free to send any of your questions in the chat, and we can relay them to the speakers later on. So now I wanted to introduce our last speaker, Angela Eifert from Alight, formerly known as American Refugee Committee. Angela?
Hi, good morning. I do have a screen share, if that's okay to pull up now. Great, let's just hope this works. And also, can you hear me okay? Everything checks out? Great. Okay, so let me pull up this, and I want to make sure we can set this to presentation mode. Are you able to see the screen? Yep, okay, perfect. Then we're halfway there. Just want to make sure I can get to this. I might have to go back to the original. Here we go. I'm having an issue seeing the bar for, it's been covered by the screen share. So, where is the?
You can always move the bar, Angela.
Oh, is that what's, okay, sorry about that. Let me see if I can do that. I don't do this very often. Okay, here we go. Here we go, slideshow. Let's hope this works. All right, I think that worked. Cool. Okay. Well, good morning again. My name is Angela Eifert, and I am the global director. I'm the director of Global Connectors at Alight, and we are connectors that find people and partners to collaborate and co-create innovative solutions for the work that we do around the world with displaced communities. And I'll tell you a little bit more about our mission as we go through. Just make sure here. Okay, so Alight is, we began our journey in 1979 with an enduring belief in the power of the possible and the abundance of everyday people. Today, we are a borderless team with 2,500 people working around the world. alongside 4 million people who've been displaced. Those who, by sheer circumstance, find themselves on a long and arduous journey of displacement, a journey that has upended their lives, their livelihoods, and their dreams. Whether that journey is 6 months or a decade, our journey ends when their journey does, when they are settled, secure, and on a pathway to thriving. We are on their journey the entire way. Everything we do starts with co-creation, integrating human-centered design into our work for more than a decade. Doing this has allowed our 2,500 humanitarians to understand the experiences of the displaced better than anyone and deliver services worthy of their humanity. At Alight, we do not refer to the people that we work with as beneficiaries. They are customers, and we work for them. We believe that their lived experience renders them as subject matter experts. Changing the relationship with the people we serve from a hand out to a hand up is central to the work that we do. Co-creation brings together a diverse set of voices, including communities, to design things or to design new things or improve on existing things. We seek local partnership at every step so that our work always aligns with our values. And not only is community far more likely to adopt a practice or service that it created, but everyone can gain valuable insights into the solution, which results in a better product that can potentially be used elsewhere. We believe in finding and uplifting the work of others and on shifting the power dynamics that have permeated our space for decades. This sets up our work to be impactful, meaningful, and sustainable for the places and communities we serve. This pushes us beyond the basic needs and brings us to design programs and services with long-term. We missed a slide, there we go. This pushes us beyond the basic needs and brings us to design programs and services with longer term needs and essentials that all human beings need. You can just take a look at the areas of focus that our focus on bringing dignity and meaning and purpose to the lives of people who've been displaced. Since 2019, we have been on a journey of becoming the 21st century humanitarian organization we believe in. We began with a core and fundamental characteristic that resides in the hearts of our community, every human being, and that is that every human being is full, whole, complex, and worthy of being truly seen. In 2019 is when we changed our name from American Refugee Committee to Alight to reflect the people that we serve more holistically. So our next, this brings us now to talk, that's who we are. And now I want to talk about climate displacement and the work that we do in that space. In 2021, there were 40.5 million new internally displaced people, the majority having fled climate disasters and environmental catastrophes. Despite the poorer communities' lower contribution to global greenhouse emissions, they are the ones withstanding the most climate-induced suffering. In the absence of a strong global response, it is estimated that 1.2 billion people could be displaced by the year 2050. The impacts include increased risks of gender-based violence for women and girls due to longer treks for water, weakened immune systems due to stress, and less access to food and water. Also, lack of care for sexual reproductive health and treatment for that care. There is also impacts on perinatal outcomes due to spread of disease, extreme weather events, and environmental toxins add to these risks. Women account for 60% of the 690 million who are food insecure due to time collecting water and firewood, and this makes their ability to feed their families more difficult, and increased needs for hygiene and health is a threat multiplier for women and girls. When supply is short, the needs of women and girls comes last, leading to illness and greater risks to health, babies and children, and pregnancy. Traditional food hierarchies put girls eating last or skipping meals altogether. What we know is that climate displacement requires both short-term and long-term solutions. In the short term, there is need for immediate disaster relief for international displaced people, internally displaced people, or IDPs. In the long term, we need to think about adaptation, sustainability, and resilience for the response efforts. We are currently working in the following populations for displaced, which include Afghans, Burmese, Congolese, Ethiopians, Somalis, South Sudanese, Syrians, Ukrainians, and Central Americans. In 2022, this is work that we did in Pakistan following monsoons and massive flooding that caused the deaths of 1,500 people, affecting 33 million countrywide and displacing nearly 8 million. A third of Pakistan is still dealing with the impacts of the water today. Climate change has been causing extreme rainfall in Pakistan, and it is predicted to worsen as global temperatures continue to rise. Alight has been working in Pakistan for over 20 years and has implemented over 64 projects spanning education, skill development, shelter, emergency protection, development needs, and health and nutrition. Somalia and other countries in the Horn of Africa are currently suffering through the most devastating severe drought in over 40 years. With 80% of the region's population dependent on farming and herding to survive, the dwindling harvests have led to dire circumstances. 40 million people across the Horn of Africa are food insecure, including 10 million children who've been acutely malnourished. The lack of access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food is forcing people to leave their homes in search of food and water security. Alight provides healthcare services, WASH services, which is water and sanitation, and nutrition support and increased food and water security in partnership with local communities like USAID and other affiliates. With the support of USAID, Alight is supplying clean drinking water to 10,000 drought-affected people in the Horn, in the Hudun district of Sul of Somalia. This devastating drought has pushed millions to flee, but this time, I'm sorry, I'm just going to stop here quickly. This is us just showing you the immediate needs, which are emergency food, and the long-term needs that we did in Somalia, which I named off already, but just wanted to, I skipped the slide. So here is a moment to pause and reflect. This devastating drought has pushed millions to flee, but this time they aren't going back, which is unlike other droughts and mass displacement due to climate, where they did go back. This time they are deciding to start over where resources are abundant and jobs can be created. And the reason for that is because they simply have faced too many of these cycles. And this was such a devastating drought that people are just tired and are choosing to make life, to start life over where they've landed. So what we're excited about in our response efforts to this mass displacement in Somalia is a partnership with Global Water First, where we are partnering together to provide long-term needs, a long-term response effort, which involves developing sustainable water businesses that will not only support the economic development of creating a new life in these locations, but also improving access to high quality water across 6 sites, most impacted by the climate migration. In this partnership scope of support, we are also building out the on-site water treatment systems, in addition to rehabilitation and maintenance support teams, and these are jobs essentially that will be created, and fast-growing tree plantations to support the restoration of the earth to prevent future drought, devastating droughts. And just for all of your engagement, the 2 ways that we are looking to support climate displacement in these parts going forward are investing in Alight's ability to instantly respond in the emergency that meets climate, that brings dignity and hope back to the lives of people in their most critical moments of displacement, and investing in water solutions for long-term support as we build out this very unique, more innovative approach in Somalia to put in these sustainable business operations that are water treatment stations across the country to provide that clean, safe drinking water access, in addition to jobs. This will be the first time that we've implemented a solution of this nature that addresses both immediate and long-term needs. So I'm going to also now move into a reflection that just, if everyone helps to hold up the sky, then one person does not become tired, is one way that we feel as an organization that we are working with everyone else, including all of you here who are joining this effort with us. And there are a few insights I do want to share that came out very recently that might also add to your knowledge of how the industry is thinking about climate migration in the humanitarian sector. And I just received some download from the Center for Climate Change and Migration. And I would have liked to edit a slide, but I did not have the opportunity, as it happened just in the last 2 days. But essentially, I'll give you the highlights, if that's okay. One of the takeaways from the new research done by the Center for Climate Change and Migration states that that the need for facilitating regional free movement is critical, as most climate migration is mostly internal and is more rural and rural-urban circular in nature. Which is true what we've seen for sure in the Horn of Africa after many cycles of climate displacement. And so people are in search of better jobs and better access to basic needs. and we'll do that more regionally or internally within the country. Where migration does cross borders, it generally is regional by nature, and refugee protections in the international level does not currently see climate migration as a protected status, as it does for political strife or war, essentially. So climate migration is still unprotected by refugee status, but it is recognized that it is an issue, and it is more likely that labor reform in the labor sector labor migration would be more successful due to the fact that changing policy at international level is so difficult. And another point made was the developing new institutional arrangements for climate conscious labor migration. This was the policy change that I just mentioned, sorry. The next one is people most affected by climate hazards will often become involuntarily mobile. So sudden or slow onset loss of assets due to climate disasters will make migration more difficult over time. So this is called distress migration, and distress migration is already happening in some areas, notably the Horn of Africa that I talked about today, and the need for location support, relocation support, and perhaps more collaboration with diaspora communities and remittance access for funding to come through the natural channels of diaspora support should be supported. Without more dignified support, systems and services for climate migration, further degradation of livelihoods and poverty will impact vulnerable populations even more. So we are looking, the last thing to just note on this is that Alight's focus on restoring dignity and building lives of meaning and purpose with and for the displaced starts with the emergency response in these moments, and we stay long-term with these communities over decades in some cases. So we care a lot about this issue, and after 45 years of doing this work around the world for displacement in the refugee scope of work, we know that climate migration is a major factor, and so we are addressing this in the innovative ways that we can with co-creation and efforts of partnerships around the world. So thank you for listening, and I'm open for questions or whatever time we have left here.
Thank you, Angela, for sharing what you and your organization does. We will now open the floor for Q&A. Audience member, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. I'll put them in the chat right now.
And I know we have a couple of questions already. There you go, Harrison. Go ahead.
Does someone else have a question first, or should I go? Okay, I can ask. This is specifically for Gail. And can everyone hear me all right? Okay. I was just wondering, so what do you feel like NGOs, local and international, have done that have really helped people in Bahamas with these hurricanes and climate disasters? And what do you think is still needed from them, or what could they be doing better?
Okay, well, we were inundated with NGOs from all over the world. We had people from the FAO, we had people from Europe, we had people from as far away as Australia. We had a lot of Christian church organizations. In fact, we have several NGOs that never left. They're still here. They're working with us, trying to help people rebuild their houses. So there's one that I can't remember what it's called. It's SB something about St. Bernard's. They teach you how to get the black mold out of your house. But they're still here. And what else? The World Central Kitchen stayed with us for one whole year. They were feeding us every day. And that was a godsend because a lot of people didn't have the wherewithal or equipment to cook, and supplies were hard to find as well. So like I said, we have a few of the NGOs that never left. They're still here with us. And what was the second half of your question?
Like what is still needed, and maybe what could some NGOs be providing or doing better in that respect?
Okay, so we have our own civil society organizations such as Rotary. Rotary has been actually building houses for people on the eastern end of the island, where many of the buildings were just wiped off the map. So they just built another 5 houses last week. So we're trying to help ourselves in that way. So it's been a huge challenge because many of the businesses that people depended on for their livelihood never reopened after the hurricane because hotels were destroyed and the people running them decided to just leave the country rather than fix them. So that's like thousands of jobs were lost. So what do those people do now? And so many people, friends of mine, have actually become climate refugees and left the country. They've relocated in other countries. A good friend of mine who was in a very stressful situation, they had to be rescued by helicopter after her mother, 80-year-old mother, was hanging onto a refrigerator because they couldn't get her up into the roof. So for 40 hours, she was hanging onto a refrigerator trying to not be swept away, but their farmhand was swept away when they were trying to let the horses out. So they lost their entire farm and everything. They went to Canada and they applied for refugee status. They were turned away. They went to the US, same thing, they were turned away. So 2 years later, they came back home and now they're trying to rebuild their farm, even though it's very traumatic just to be there, knowing of what happened there. So it's really hard for people. And actually, I can tell you my long-term plan is to leave the country. I'm not going to stay here because I don't see any future in a low-lying country.
Thank you, Gail.
You're welcome.
I have another question. So what steps can be taken to ensure voices and perspectives of climate refugees are included in decision-making process and policy development?
So if I understand correctly, I think the question is, how can more climate refugees be invited to sit at the table of decision-making? Yeah, it's this is definitely an increasing issue across all of solution building for the work that we do in the humanitarian space. And so really, I think it is philanthropists, where money is flowing is where it should be really, pressure should be put on that those efforts are done in a human-centered way where the communities are at the table. And so there's a lot of partners, a lot of organizations that do this work in the humanitarian space, and to always have that kind of question as a funder, that is what I would say first off is just funders should have that as a priority in their request or in their effort to fund something that they care about. And Alight, from Alight's perspective, human-centered design has been our journey for the last 10 years. And it's a very big focal point of how we are moving forward, in that all of our strategy is refugee-led. So our efforts across the board, across the 20 countries we work in, are largely human-centered in scope, and refugee-led is our #1 priority. So in those efforts that we're doing, they are at the table, they are leading the effort, and they are also, 96% of our work is we hire people who have either been displaced or are living in these countries that they are fleeing to. So yeah, we feel pretty good about that as a priority for sure. But I would just say for everyone else, and funding is always kind of where everything starts, it seems, in the terms of policy and how things are done. So that's where I would say, really think about refugee-led voices in the scope of any response effort, and make that a priority.
And I have another question for you, Angela. Do you work with assisting migration? If so, what are the steps taken to reduce the displaced vulnerabilities in the process?
So we do, in the scope of refugee, if people are fleeing persecution or a protected status of cause for refugees, if they're deemed refugees, yes, we are meeting people on that journey in the moment of crisis, and supporting them to transition to a safe location. We're assisting them with the process of getting their refugee status, but basically we do that work through providing the basic needs, and we partner with the partners that UN partners that are doing this work collaboratively in the humanitarian scope. In terms of people who are not considered refugees, like economic migration or climate migration, in this case, we still, especially in Somalia, where we work anyway, we've been working there for over 20 years. And so because we were there, when climate strikes a disaster, we of course are there to respond to the humanitarian need. Now, in other parts of the world where we're not already sitting, that's not the case. So migration's a little bit more difficult because it's not a refugee protected space. But we do see these populations as very vulnerable, and it does fall under our strategy of protective. We do protection work, and where we can add value, we do assess and consider if we will open into a new country. So for example, in Mexico, we are working on the border in partnership with Catholic Sisters to provide safe houses for migrants who've been sitting on the Mexico side waiting for processing into the US. But we do not work on the US side in any way, and we certainly don't work in any policy efforts of migration in that way. But we do want to respond to the human needs of people who are at risk. So in that way, we partner with community safe houses with Catholic Sisters all across the border. And we had been doing that for the last 3 years, where we're recognizing families who need basic needs, and we've been supporting the Catholic Sisters to provide the best care they can. So that's how we've been working on that issue.
Thank you, Angela. That concludes our Q&A session. We want to invite each of you to sign the Global Climate Pledge. If you're an NGO and would like to further work with us, or would like to know more information, just send us an email. I'll put it in the chat. I would now like to hand it over to Michelle for the closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I know that we're running a few minutes late, so really appreciate everyone staying with us. And we've had some wonderful comments and remarks in the chat for our speakers today. So I just want to thank you again for joining us for this very important and emotional discussion on the topic of climate migration. We hope each of you are inspired to take new action within your organization and or your communities. for both your existing and as well as future projects. So many thanks to our speakers, Angela and Gail, and Helder as well. Thank you so much. And really, we want to thank our very young and talented leaders, including Angie, Joyce, Lizzie, Sam, and Harrison, who are responsible for bringing everyone together today. So please join us for future webinars, including our next one on Indigenous nations and climate action. And if you have any ideas for topics of interest, please let us know in the email that has been provided in the chat. So thank you again so much for joining us, and we will see you again at our next webinar. Bye, everyone.